The Quadruped Rock is our second of 3 passive tests within the screening. Like the hip scour, it looks at how wide a client's stance needs to be to get the greatest amount of hip flexion. Now, whereas the hip scour works on only one leg at a time, the Quadruped Rock is our first opportunity to see how both legs work together. During the Quadruped Rock, we'll be looking to answer 2 questions. First, how wide do the knees need to be to get the maximum amount of hip flexion? This translates to depth in the squat. And lastly, we want to know if there's any pain going on. To conduct this test, you'll need a broomstick and a flat surface with enough space for the client to get on their hands and knees and for you to move around them. Whereas in the hip scour I was doing all the work, this time it's all on Joe. So before we go any further, let's have a quick look at the movement. Joe's set up on his hands and knees and he's using his arms to drive his hips towards his heels. What you can't see is that he's bearing most of his weight through his arms, not his knees. This is to keep the hamstrings relaxed. If there's too much weight through the knees, the hamstrings may contract and that'll compromise the test. Now that we've got a general idea of the movement, let's look at it in more detail. Joe's palms are flat on the ground, his index fingers are pointing straight ahead, and his elbows are extended. He's got a nice neutral midline, and his knees are directly under his hips. As I move behind Joe, I'm looking at his knee width. To start with, I want to use the optimal width identified during the hip scour. Later on I might repeat the test with a wider or narrower stance in search of more depth, but that width from the hip scour is where I'll start. Next is that neutral midline, and this is where the broomstick comes in. The broomstick is going to provide me with a visual reference, and Joe with a kinesthetic reference for a neutral spine position. The broomstick goes along the length of the spine, and Joe needs to maintain 3 points of contact with it: the head, the shoulders, and the butt. Losing a point of contact indicates loss of that neutral spine position. Now that everything's set, I'll get Joe to do a couple of dry runs just to make sure everything's working correctly. I'll cue him to brace his midline, and I'll use my fingertips to press lightly on his hamstrings, right in the middle of the muscle belly. Then I'll tell him to start driving his hips towards his heels. I'm watching his midline to see if he breaks position, and I'm feeling for any contraction in the hamstrings. If I feel those hamstrings contract, there's a couple of things I'll look at. First is to make sure he's remembered to keep his weight through his arms and not his legs, and that he's keeping his lower body relaxed. The second thing is his hand placement. If his hands are too far forward when starting the movement, his weight will shift rearward as he moves those hips back. So be prepared to do a few more practice runs until you've sorted out hand placement. If, after a few attempts, he can't move without those hamstrings contracting, I'm going to cancel this test and move on. I need those hamstrings to be loose for the results to be valid. If that happens and I lose this test, I'm going to be more dependent on the hip scour for finding the optimal stance, and I'll spend more time on the squats test, testing different stance widths to find the best position. Assuming that practice went well, now we're ready to do the test. The first thing I want to look at is how wide his knees need to be to get the maximum amount of hip flexion. I'll move across to Joe's side and get him to begin the movement. I'm watching his hips and lumbar for any change from that neutral starting position. Once I see a change, I'll get Joe to stop moving and return to that last point before the fault occurred. From there, I'm going to use my hand to measure the distance between the glute and the heel. That measurement is going to be my reference point for depth when I start testing wider and narrower widths. Depending on the distance, you can use a fist and measure by the knuckles, or a splayed hand and measure by the fingers. Keep in mind that this glute to heel measurement is unique to the person doing the assessment. This is because hand and finger size will vary from person to person. It's not meant to provide an exact measurement of difference, but a way to compare depth. Now, what if you can't see any lumbar flexion or tilting of the hips? Then you need to get that broomstick back in position and repeat the test. What you're looking for is a change in the space between the broomstick and the body, or a loss of one of those 3 points of contact. When you see it, get them to stop moving and return to that last point before the fault occurred, then measure the glute to heel distance. Now that I have a baseline for depth, I can begin to try different knee widths. I'll test wider and narrower positions, repeating that glute to heel measurement to see which knee width provides the shortest distance between the glutes and the heels. Don't forget that we need this to apply to the squat, so be mindful of going much wider than outside of the shoulder or so narrow that balance would become a problem in the squat. Whichever knee width provides the shortest glute to heel distance is the one you want to record in the screening performer. Like the hip scour, The knee width can be marked down as hip width, shoulder width, outside the shoulder, or somewhere in between. Lastly, make a note of any pain that occurred during the movement. Before we move on, here's a few points to keep in mind during the quadruped rock. The client's doing most of the work, so give them a demonstration of what you want and take them through a couple of dry runs to make sure they've got it. Make sure the midline is braced and that the movement is driven by their arms. And lastly, before they begin moving, pull their clothing taut so you've got a clear view of the lumbar and the hips, and avoid doing this test in anything thick and baggy like a jumper. The data you've collected in this test can be compared to the hip scour and the squats tests. For the hip scour, you want to compare the optimal width for maximum depth. If one test shows less hip flexion than the other, stick with the smaller amount of hip flexion. It's better to underestimate their depth and find more later than it is to overestimate it and risk injury. If you do find a difference in knee width for maximum depth, take the average from the two tests and work from there. For the squats test, you're looking at the same area, optimal width for maximum depth, but you're comparing their passive range with their active range. To sum up, the quadruped rock is our second of 3 passive tests within the screening. Like the hip scour, it looks at how wide a client's stance needs to be to get the greatest amount of hip flexion. Whereas the hip scour works on only one leg at a time, the quadruped rock is our first opportunity to see how both legs work together.